How do Edward Said, the music of Johan Sebastian Bach, and Michel Foucault resonate? Who was Edward Said? How do our preconceptions of Orientalist representations distort and stereotype Eastern cultures? And are representations always political? These elements and questions compose today's topic, Orientalism. Welcome to Political Compositions, where we explore the last 250 years of political, social, and cultural philosophy. I am Jamie.
I'm Gijs.
And join us in confronting the foremost philosophers, movements, and ideas from past and present, which compose political philosophy today. So turn on, tune in, but don't drop out.
So, Jamie, what can we expect from today's episode?
We'll go into Edward Said's biography, his cultural challenges, his political orientation, and even into his musical tastes. Now, Gijs, why is all this relevant in a podcast about political compositions?
Discussing an author is not always relevant or interesting for political compositions, to be sure. And in academia, we tend to cultivate a style of writing and perhaps even of thinking that aims to be author independent, so to speak. You could even call it anonymous writing.
I would say that's especially the case for analytic philosophy.
For sure. In analytic philosophy, there's very little place for something like style or personality, except perhaps for unusual cases like that of Ludwig Wittgenstein, also someone, by the way, whose biography is extremely interesting and unusual, although that seems mostly unrelated to his philosophical style of writing.
Isn't it actually an advantage that one doesn't need to know much about an author when reading their work? I mean, shouldn't a text speak for itself, and shouldn't philosophical arguments be self-explanatory?
Good point. That touches on the nature of philosophical writing and in what sense it differs from other genres, such as literature, essayism, or, for instance, autobiography. Typically genres, by the way, that Edward Said practiced, next to his more academic work in what we in the university call comparative literature and in the humanities.
Given that we are going to talk about Orientalism in the way in which it was personal for Edward Said, and even how this shows up in his writing, perhaps it's a good idea to already give a brief indication of what this idea of Orientalism is about in broad strokes.
Yeah, on the one hand, Orientalism is the traditional name for the study of what, back in the day, was called the Orient. So basically everything which is for us to the east of ourselves, us being the West. Said understood that the fact that we as Western scholars study the Orient also tells us something about ourselves. We are fascinated by the Orient, both the Near and the Far East, because we find it both primitive and sophisticated, both attractive and somehow obscure and dangerous. But more importantly, Said also understood that in the way we study the Orient, we are projecting stereotypes upon it that say more about ourselves than about them.
Okay, well, we'll go into that in some more detail later on. Now, Said was a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University in New York, and he actually held that position until he died in 2003 at age 68. Now, this might seem strange to discuss in a political philosophy podcast, but it's a strange and fascinating field, isn't it? Comparative literature, I mean. And perhaps you can shortly say something about its role vis-a-vis philosophy and, say, politics.
Yes, comparative literature is a field where you never really know what you're going to get. It's a very versatile field that studies writing across all sorts of boundaries: language, nationality, geography, gender, ethnicity, whatever academic discipline. It is, in a way, everything that other academic disciplines are not. It provides space and freedom denied by other disciplines.
And also why writing in comparative literature is often very much politically engaged, or more generally, language departments in the United States, at least, are much more political than departments of philosophy.
Or even, in many cases, departments of political science.
Right. But so why is that, would you say?
Well, part of it is that using language is in itself, in a sense, a political act. If this sounds odd, Consider what Aristotle said about language. It serves to distinguish good from bad, advantages from disadvantages, honorable from shameful. Such distinctions are themselves always already political, in the sense that they determine how the social world is to be experienced and is to be ruled. So, different for people of color than for white people, different for women than for men, different for proletarians than for the bourgeoisie, etc.
In our case, we should note that this idea of shaping or dividing the social world is represented in the thought of the French philosopher Jacques Rancière. Rancière is the kind of philosopher for whom politics is very close to aesthetics.
As it was for Hannah Arendt. Rancière and Arendt both feel that politics is something radical. It involves breaking with the way things are commonly done, and maybe even more importantly, with the way things are commonly perceived and experienced. The regime of perception, as we might call it.
And does all this mean that we should categorize Said as a radical thinker?
No, actually I don't think so. The notion of Orientalism is radical, to be sure, but Said as a person, not so much. Actually, he was surprised that this book on Orientalism drew so much attention. He himself thought of it as a scholarly work which wouldn't arouse that much attention outside of a limited circle of scholars, much less mobilize large groups for or against a cause, or create heated political and academic controversy.
But it's not a conventional or mainstream figure either, though. He was an advocate for Palestinian self-determination, even politically involved, but always independent and critical. And he was a leading figure in the field of the humanities already when he was in his early 30s. Puts me to shame, maybe. Next to this, he was an expert on classical music and a very good musician himself.
Yes, come to think of it, in both these latter ways, he is very much like Richard Sennett, who is about 8 years younger than Said, and who founded the Institute for the Humanities at NYU in the mid-70s. Both also work at the intersection of philosophy and literature, although actually you would be hesitant to call either of them a philosopher. They are typical humanities figures, and, to put it more traditionally, typical Renaissance figures.
Right, which is its own stereotype, I guess, because the Renaissance man, or Vitruvian man sometimes, after the drawing by Da Vinci, supposedly covering the perfect measurements of man, is rooted in a time where we thought of some people as legitimate experts in, well, practically all fields. But in more modern lingo, we would probably mean something like they know a lot about a lot.
Exactly.
Let's zoom in a little bit on the person of Edward Said so that we can establish why, in his case, the personal and the philosophical are closely intertwined. His name is already something of a giveaway, isn't it?
Yeah, this is something he himself often mentioned, this odd combination of British and Arabic. He hated his very British first name, Edward. He would have preferred an Arabic name, also because his family name, Said, is of course Arabic. Anyway, Said was born in Jerusalem in 1935, in what was then the British Mandate for Palestine. Long story. His mother, Hilda, was half Palestinian, half Lebanese. His father, Wadi, was Palestinian.
So they lived in Jerusalem?
No, actually mostly in Cairo, although the family kept a family house in Jerusalem and traveled a lot around what was called the Levant, roughly the Middle East, because of his father's business dealings. The Said family was cosmopolitan and quite well-to-do. Edward attended elite schools in Cairo when he was young. Among his classmates were, for instance, the later actor Omar Sharif and the future King Hussein of Jordan. And in terms of identity, the Saids mostly wanted to be recognized by their social environment as Palestinian Arabs. This was not so easy because they belonged to a Christian, Eastern Orthodox minority within Palestinian Arabs of about 10%. And then again, within that minority, they belonged to a tiny Anglican subgroup.
So in the Arab cultural world, they were seen as Christians?
Not really. These kinds of Christian denominations, although meaningful and important within a Christian context, were seen by the Muslim Arab world in terms of merely one more tribe of some kind. In this case, that of Shawam, a name for Levantian Egyptians, or sometimes also called Syrian Christians. Even more complicated, Said also held an American passport, as his father possessed American citizenship.
Well, how did that happen?
Well, during the First World War, Wadi Said, his father, fled the Middle East to avoid conscription by the Ottoman army and wound up in the USA, where he successfully applied for citizenship.
Wow. So, it's quite a complex family and, say, mixed up history in terms of religion, ethnicity, and nationality. And I imagine he must have been multilingual, mastering both English and Arab.
Sure, especially the daily variety of Arabic that was commonly used out on the streets. His father, though, didn't speak Arabic well, but his mother Hilda did, who was a supporter of Nasser, the Egyptian president at that time, who was, after all, an Arabic nationalist.
Right.
The more formal Arabic he learned only later as a grown-up. By the way, as a grown-up in the USA, he also spoke 2 forms of English, American and the Oxford-throated English that he picked up in high school in Cairo. Next to that, he also spoke French fluently, and he could read in Arabic, Italian, Latin, German, and Spanish.
So it's not so odd that he actually ended up in comparative literature.
No, it's not. And it says something about Said's identity as someone who moved between languages, especially between Arabic and English. A roommate at the university once observed that when Said talked in his sleep, he spoke Arabic.
That reminds me of that question people ask multilingual people in general. But in what language do you think? From now on, though, I will ask, okay, but in what language do you dream? Although I guess the point here is that he was born into 2 languages, so to speak.
Yeah, in Said's case, even 3. Music being a third language. He was a very good amateur pianist and an absolute lover of classical music. Back in his time in Cairo, he already went to the opera often, and in the USA studied for a while at Juilliard, the prestigious music academy in New York. Again, just like Richard Sennett, by the way. He also wrote a lot about music, for instance, opera reviews or more essay-like pieces in the journal The Nation.
I feel you're going to tell me that Richard Sennett did that as well.
He did, although not in the form of music essayism, but in a novel about a couple who are both professional musicians but not equally successful or gifted. And in his work on craftsmanship, the feel of the musician for the instrument, so the material touch, so to speak, is often brought up to bring across what it is that the craftsman knows.
Okay, well, we will get back to the aspect of music and its relation to philosophy later on in this podcast. But first, I was wondering if there is some analogy or relevance also in this specific notion of craftsmanship.
Yes, come to think of it, there is, but in a more unexpected way. Sennett, you could say, wants to defend the craftsman against attacks from the philosopher. Think of Socrates, who walks around on the Athenian agora, bothering ordinary people like shoemakers with questions like, okay, it's nice that you can make shoes, but tell me, what is a shoe? Leaving them dumbfounded, unable to digest why understanding what a shoe is should be more important than understanding how to make one.
I mean, in philosophy classes, they usually present this as a most memorable moment, right? Socrates representing the beginning of rational investigation against something like blindly following traditional wisdom, like how the shoemaker learned the trade from a parent.
Yes, but by doing so, Socrates destroyed the object he pretended to investigate. The shoemaker was left devastated and confused, abused, you might say, by the philosopher. So in a comparable way, Said wanted to show how the Orientalist scientist devastated and destroyed the object he pretended to investigate, the Orient or the Oriental.
Should we think of the Orientalist scholars as philosophers then?
No, Orientalists were usually literary or religious scholars, or perhaps archaeologists or historians. But their transgression, so to speak, was similar to that of the philosopher. Mostly without realizing it, their scientific investigation also entailed a cultural domination of their object and an imposition on it. They assimilated Eastern cultural phenomena into Western knowledge.
But that makes me think it's almost like a neutral act, whereas Orientalism is also about how stereotypes were imposed, for instance. The Oriental as treacherous, seductive, dangerous, sensuous, you name it. And these gained a life of their own, as it were.
Yes, Orientalism is not just domination. It also has to do with an image of how the so-called Oriental is supposed to look like or to be. You tend to perceive the practices and ideas of another culture through the preconceptions of your own culture. Also, when you're academic and you're trained in objectively carrying out an investigation. In the case of Orientalism, those preconceptions also imply that you engage in negative stereotypes of the other. So, like the treacherous, seductive Oriental you mentioned. A stereotype, of course, says more about the person using it than about the person that it's applied to.
Is Said's work about giving a moral rebuke to Western scholars for being, say, maybe in modern lingo, biased when studying Eastern phenomena?
It would be tempting to think so, but no. It's not about ethics or morality, and Orientalism as presented by Said is not even a politically motivated position, although it is certainly possible to put Orientalism to political uses.
Now, before people get confused, we should point out the ambiguity in the use of the term Orientalism. It refers to the traditional scientific way to study the East, but has come to refer to the critique of this tradition by Said. And of course, it is also the title of his book on the subject.
Yes, and it's important to realize that Said doesn't simply want the West to stop studying the East. He valued the knowledge created by Western scholars, and he didn't want us to ignore it because it is created by privileged white people. On the contrary, he has a very high regard for Western academic scholarship, yet he wants to point out that there is something structurally wrong with it as it was applied to the Orient.
Which he also problematizes itself as an already very questionable concept. It is something of a catch-all term. I mean, what does it even refer to? It seems to indicate that the Middle East, but also China, Indonesia, Japan, and so on, are all one thing. And then it's difficult to tell where it's supposed to stop. I mean, is Africa included somehow? Like, for instance, Egypt.
Yes, it is a weird concept. A remnant of the days when the West had a more self-evident superior connotation than nowadays. The West sometimes referred to itself in German as the Abendland, the land of the evening, referring to Europe as it was back then perceived from the perspective of the Levant. For them, Europe was the region where the sun was setting.
While on the other hand, or rather on the other end of the world, what for us is the East, there is Japan, which is traditionally referred to as the land of the rising sun. Now, apparently this derives from Japanese imperial correspondence in something like the 7th century BC with the Chinese Sui dynasty. As of course, from a Chinese perspective, the sun rises over Japan. So it is technically an exonym, a name given by an outside or other people or country, rather than an endonym, a name derived from a self-description.
Yes, and the fun fact here is that when you Google Land of the Rising Sun, many people apparently ask whether it's still okay today to use this expression.
So they're afraid that they are part of stereotyping the East of, say, Orientalism.
Apparently so. Anyway, it's probably better than the old habits. I remember a story told by one of our favorite critical theorists, Susan Buck-Morse, who after 9/11 wanted to know more about Islam, but was at a loss where to find such knowledge at her university, which is Cornell, a prestigious Ivy League college, right? She was then told to go to the Near Eastern department, as that was sort of automatically supposed to cover all things Islam. She replied, "Have you ever heard of Indonesia?" Being the country, of course, with the largest Islamic population on earth.
Yeah, I mean, there are many preconceptions like that. Like with Said, by the way. I mean, many people think all Arabs must be Muslims, including Palestinians like Said. While, on the other hand, as you said, among Muslims, Said had difficulty being recognized as an Arab.
While in the United States, Said was very good in passing for an American. Therefore, many people, especially, of course, his many critics, found it difficult to see him as an authentic Palestinian.
Although authenticity is a philosophically problematic claim in itself, especially when it concerns a people or land that has been denied the ability to build up any kind of authentic form of life, which is maybe not so strange when you read in his biography that he used to make remarks like, "Can you imagine a man too busy to go to his tailor?"
Well, he was an upper-class Palestinian after all. But yes, identifying an English gentleman scholar at an American Ivy League university as a Palestinian is something of a tour de force, something of a stretch. But it does confirm Said's point. We do tend to see Orientals in a stereotypical way. For instance, they should not dress like English gentlemen, or be scholars of Joseph Conrad, as was the case with Said, or be experts in Western classical music.
Or be invited to a prestigious conference about structuralism and post-structuralism in the United States when barely 30 years old.
That conference in Baltimore in 1966, where, of all people, a small black and very much Arab Jew was to give a lecture that changed the course of modern philosophy.
Which, by the way, was not Said, but Jacques Derrida.
Yes, the description that I gave was actually how Derrida described himself. He was not yet very famous at the time, but he was black enough and, as he said, very much an Arab, being born and having spent his whole youth in Algeria. In those days, of course, still a French colony.
So Said and Derrida were or are brothers in arms, philosophical and literary arms though.
Although philosophically, Said is actually closer to Michel Foucault, who wasn't born in Africa, although he spent 2 years teaching in Tunisia.
And Foucault didn't write anything on Orientalism, even though he could have.
He could have, but his interest was more traditional in a way. He questioned the self-certainty of Western knowledge production, in that sense fully in the tradition of René Descartes. However, where Descartes thought that rationality can be distinguished from its enemy madness, his famous malin génie, namely through systematic introspection, Foucault claims that this distinction is socially produced and enforced.
Okay, so a fundamental difference of insight for philosophy that also says something about how thinking has changed over the last 300 years. But more importantly, how is this relevant for Said?
Foucault said that Western rationality is produced, so to speak, when certain authorities, such as psychiatrists in the 17th century, declared that those who are mad, so those who suffer from mental disorders, are also to be considered irrational and that they should be isolated and incarcerated, together with other social misfits such as homeless people, criminals, drunks, etc. The upshot of this procedure was that in reverse, we could declare those not belonging to this category, that is to say everybody else in society, like us, to be mentally sane and rational.
So if I understand you correctly, Said concluded that for Western society, the Orient is something like this collection of misfits and madmen.
That's the idea, with the added benefit that in reverse, Western society could declare itself to be rational, in a way simply because the Orient, being so very different from us, is not. So the point here again is that the distinction between who is rational and who is not is a social distinction, not a philosophical, psychiatric or psychological one.
So this is the trick of Orientalism then. They are not rational, hence we are.
Yes, a perfect counterpoint to Descartes' I think, therefore I am, isn't it?
Except that Descartes used the statement as a thought experiment to prove his own existence, but Orientalism was much more than such a thought experiment.
Yeah, much more, for sure. The point is that this thought trick was implemented through an impressive array of scientific knowledge, military power, and colonialist politics. To conquer the Orient, this silent, un-Christian and distant region, it was not enough to invade it. It needed to be known, very Foucaultian insight, and then recreated on Western terms.
What do you mean by recreated?
In the Western academic way, we sent in a whole army of scholars, and of course, when convenient, real soldiers and administrators who literally and figuratively dug up forgotten histories, languages, races, and cultures.
So literally and figuratively an archaeology.
Yes.
Seems like a lot of effort went into this archaeological project. So let's take a step back and ask, why was all this activity undertaken? Because these projects are neither naive expressions of academic curiosity, nor are they cynical expressions of power. It is maybe both and neither.
Indeed, it's neither just cynical nor naive. This digging up of forgotten languages and histories is quite a cunning project. It basically entailed the production of a different Orient, of using history, or indeed archaeology, to reconstruct what we consider to be the true classical Orient that could be used to judge and rule the modern Orient.
But that does sound cynical, though, and maybe has the perverse effect that our Orient, the one the West dug up and created through scientific and cultural means, is truer than theirs.
That's the idea. We beat them at their own game, so to speak. Or rather, we invented a game that we then said is their game, although we are better at playing it.
I mean, it sounds like deception to me.
Well, it's more like inventing a genre or maybe a paradigm and being able to present it as the best one, or maybe the most distinguished or honorable one. Not so different from how Socrates and Plato operated back in the times of classical Athens.
Now, when philosophy took over the place of tragedy and rhetoric and imposed itself on the Greek polis as the best and ultimate way of understanding oneself and the world.
Orientalism did something like that with the Orient. We did not only override the Orient, we overruled it by knowing and understanding it in a certain way, a scientific way, and therefore controlling it. We understood them better than they understood themselves, as they would say in philosophical hermeneutics.
Colonialism is thus not only a material or exploitative move, but also had an ethical component, what has become known as the self-ascribed white man's burden. And we still find vestiges of this attitude when today, say, the United States or maybe Russia invades a country or another country or the same country again. We talked about how Orientalism is a project of reconstructing the Orient, not in its own image, but in our image of it, and even using the Orient to project our negative stereotypes on it in order to feel superior ourselves. Although, of course, this was not explicitly intended or spelled out in this way.
Indeed, Orientalism was a very serious science, which delivered very interesting and worthwhile results in the sphere of, say, archaeology, language, religion, art. Before we conclude that it is just some thinly disguised colonial power trip.
Right, but we should conclude that Orientalism presented us with a wrong and problematic image of the Orient, no? I mean, one that perverts how the Orient truly or really is.
It's tempting to think so, but Said says no, because that would imply essentialism.
And that's a mortal sin in modern philosophy.
Yeah, Said's point is that there is no Oriental essence, which can then be misrepresented by the West, or perhaps by the Orient itself. That idea would not only be essentialist, but also fundamentalist, a cause for calls to go back to the days when, presumably, things were still in their essential and correct state.
All right, that's a nice philosophical point, but should we then conclude that Western Orientalism did not really damage the East? Because there is no Eastern essence to be damaged?
That would be a little too easy. As Said himself argued, the depictions of the West certainly imposed certain stereotypes onto the real existing people in the Middle East and Asia. But the damage didn't consist in violating some presumed Eastern essence. For Said, all representations operate for a purpose, or according to some tendency. There are no neutral representations.
Right, because representations are always political.
Representations are always political.
To round off this episode of our podcast, let's go back more to the person of Edward Said. In relation to Orientalism, of course, but the question imposes itself, doesn't it? How he thought of himself in the light of his own conception of Orientalism. Orientalism is full of problematic pretenses, double dealing, so to speak, and ambiguous valuations. The West goes and investigates the East as to find something that it does not have itself, yet a thing it obviously feels is somehow important to understand itself.
Yes, why else do all this? Orientalism hopes and expects to find something in the Orient which is alien to itself, yet feels like something that needs to be understood and in that sense appropriated by it.
A very Hegelian sense this is, by the way.
Very, as well as a touch of Derrida, we might add, as this mysterious something that we hope to find in the Orient might well be described as a supplement.
As we discussed in a previous episode.
A supplement being something that is added, but in and through the addition turns out to be crucial for the thing, in this case, our own self-understanding, the thing that it is added to.
All right, so how about Said himself?
Very much the same, I should think. His critical analysis of Orientalism is also, and I think inevitably, a critical analysis of himself as someone who is himself biographically a product of the forces of Orientalism. In his own person, he is both the subject, the object, and the critic of Orientalism, so to speak.
Gives a new twist to the saying that somebody is both prosecutor, judge, and jury all in one.
Something like that. And as these are potentially conflicting roles, there are plenty of conflicts to go on inside of Said as well. We already noted some of the biographical conflicts, his identity as an Arab, a Palestinian, and a Western scholar, and also as a politically engaged person and citizen. For instance, he was involved in the editing and translating of the famous speech held by then PLO chairman Yasser Arafat at the United Nations in 1974, which was quite a controversial undertaking at the time, as many people in the West considered the PLO to be a terrorist organization, and Arafat in his speech extended both an olive branch to the West and a threat.
And in what sense it, or rather academics, should be politically engaged.
Yes, and in Said's case, how he could align this with his identity as a Palestinian, an Arab, and an American, and his role as professor of comparative literature, or even as university professor in the humanities at Columbia University, one of the most prestigious positions you can have as a humanities scholar anywhere.
And do you feel he has found a way to untangle this knot or to resolve these paradoxes?
Big question. From the more academic perspective, especially the humanities part is difficult and ambiguous here, and it's not hard to see why.
Right, because what's in a name, we could say. Humanities aim to speak for the whole world, literally on what is human.
Right. So it is very much part and parcel of Western thought, ever since, say, the Renaissance. Humanities is a part of the world that, on behalf of the rest of the world, understands the world. I mean, humanities can be very sensitive to differences of all kinds, but still, it does so in the name of what we believe is the human.
And how did this play out in Said's case?
I think we should say that he was a critic of the humanities in the name of the humanities. He challenged the Western form of understanding the rest, but he still remained a great believer in Western thought, Western literature, Western music.
Art, religion, and philosophy, as Hegel would say.
Absolutely. I do believe, though, that he did find at least a specific form to address the ambiguity and complexity of the human, including his own predicament, namely through music.
Yes, you mentioned that he was versed in music as a performer, listener, and scholar, and especially classical music. He was very much invested in it.
Well, you can leave out the especially. It was only classical music that interested him, and only Western classical music. He believed it had the power to bring people together across ethnic and religious lines. That's also why he founded the so-called West Eastern Divan Orchestra, together with the extraordinary conductor and pianist Daniel Barenboim.
Who is Jewish.
Yes, and an Argentinian and a Jew by birth, but cosmopolitan in mind and spirit, like Said. This orchestra brings together players from both Israel and Palestine, but also from Egypt, Iran, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Spain. And the idea is to promote understanding and friendship, especially between Palestinians and Israeli, and between Arabs and Jews more generally, through making music together.
That's about the power of music in general, and has maybe only gotten more pressing over the last 20 years since Said's passing. But on a more personal level, though, what kind of classical music did Said himself particularly like? I understand this also has some bearing on his philosophical thought.
Yeah, he particularly loved opera, but also, and this goes almost without saying for lovers of classical music, Johan Sebastian Bach. And most especially Bach as played by that most unlikely of geniuses, Glenn Gould.
People who are unfamiliar with Glenn Gould or perhaps the music of Bach should look up a particular favorite of Said on YouTube, which is not just Said's favorite, I should add. I'm talking about Glenn Gould's performance of Bach's Goldberg variations, to hear what Said heard and wrote about: the simultaneity of voices, the unbelievable control of the musical lines, the apparently endless inventiveness of the composition, and of Gould's performance of it.
There's a great moment in a TV documentary about Glenn Gould when a woman from Russia tells the story that she had been ill and bedridden for a long time, when suddenly her husband called and said, without explanation, "You must turn on the radio right now." And she was immediately transfixed by what she heard. This was Glenn Gould playing the Goldberg variations, although she had neither heard of Glenn Gould nor the Goldberg variations ever before in her life. She said that for a moment she felt like being cured. But what especially stuck with me is her observation that he was playing as if he were praying. I think one of the most perceptive remarks about Glenn Gould's piano playing ever made.
So, is there a religious dimension to this kind of music?
With Bach, sure, always. But the point here is more, forgive the pun here, the counterpoint, which is more or less the technical musical term for what you just mentioned. The simultaneous voices that seem to continuously refer to each other, moving towards and away from each other, the strict compositional control needed for this to happen, the sense that nevertheless something new is being invented all the time. To master counterpoint is, in a way, to play God, an idea that Said took from Thomas Mann's great novel Dr. Faustus. No one, Said believed, could do counterpoint more than Glenn Gould.
Okay. Then, finally, what does this tell us about Said and his relation to Orientalism?
Well, polyphony in itself, so the multiplicity of voices in music or in general, sort of exemplifies Said's humanistic mission of the preservation of difference without desire to dominate. It's literally expressed in and by the music. But let me quote Said himself on your more specific question here. In his earliest publication about politics in the Middle East, titled A Palestinian Voice, Said writes that after the creation of Israel in 1948, the Jewish rhythm of life had supplanted a more inclusive one, the Palestinian rhythm of life, which before 1948, he says, had allowed Christian, Muslim and Jew to live in counterpoint with each other.
This podcast was made possible by the Erasmus School of Philosophy and the Center for Learning and Innovation at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. A special mention goes out to Mirjam Fuselier and Sun Liu. Thank you, Sam Vitikainen, for the beautiful opening and closing theme, Daniel Nolet for his expert mastering, and thanks to Ludo de Bo for his insights and guidance in this project. Finally, we would like to thank our editor extraordinaire, Max Wasser.